My name is Vera Blackwood. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I worked inside large organizations, places built on hierarchy, language, and the quiet assumption that some people exist to be listened to and others exist to make things easier. People usually describe me the same way: calm, capable, low maintenance. I'm the one who doesn't raise her voice in meetings, the one who doesn't interrupt, the one who sends follow-up emails instead of forcing the room to stop. To many, that reads as softness. To some, it reads as harmlessness. To a few, it reads as something exploitable. This is not a story about revenge. It's not a story about winning, humiliating anyone, or burning a system down. It's a story about what happens when you report the truth and the system quietly decides you are the problem. For a long time, I believed in process. I believed that if something was wrong, you documented it. If someone crossed a line, you raised it respectfully. If leadership failed, the structure above them would correct it. That belief shaped how I behaved, how long I stayed silent, and how surprised I was by what came next. What you're about to hear is a whistleblower's story of retaliation and survival, but not the kind you usually see on the news. There are no dramatic walkouts, no viral moments, no courtroom monologues, just a series of small decisions made by powerful people who never thought I would push back, and a series of quieter decisions I made once I understood the rules had changed. This story moves slowly on purpose, because that's how these things actually happen. Retaliation doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives as a tone, as exclusion, as subtle reassignments, as the quiet rewriting of who you are in a room you're no longer invited into. You'll hear about how I was perceived, about the first moment I noticed something was wrong, and how everyone else pretended it wasn't. About the long stretch of time where I stayed quiet, not out of fear, but out of calculation I didn't yet know I was making. And eventually, you'll hear about the point where survival stopped meaning enduring and started meaning choosing myself without needing to punish anyone else. I'm telling this story now for one reason only: honesty. Not to dramatize, not to inspire outrage, and not to position myself as a hero. There are things I could have done earlier. There are things I didn't understand until it was too late to go back. And there are things I did right only because I learned to stop explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. If you've ever been the person who followed the rules and paid for it quietly, if you've ever realized too late that being easy to work with made you easy to erase, then maybe some part of this story will feel familiar. Before we begin, I want to ask you one gentle question, no answer required yet. Have you ever looked back and realized the moment you should have trusted your discomfort came much earlier than you allowed yourself to admit? To them, I was dependable. That was the word most often attached to my name when I wasn't in the room. Dependable didn't mean visible. It didn't mean influential. It meant that things didn't break when I was involved, and no one had to think too hard about how or why. Dependable people fade into systems the way well-written code does, only noticed when it's gone. In meetings, I sat slightly back from the table, not because I lacked confidence, but because I listened better from there. I took notes that others didn't bother with. I remembered timelines. I followed up on decisions people had already emotionally moved past. When something sensitive needed handling quietly, my manager would say, "Let Vera take care of it." And I would. I wasn't invited into power, I was invited into cleanup. Most of the executives knew my face, but not my voice. They knew my emails, clear, concise, never accusatory, but rarely remembered that a human being sent them. I was addressed with appreciation that felt genuine and hollow at the same time. "We couldn't do this without you," they'd say, then proceed exactly as if they could. I didn't challenge authority publicly. I didn't posture. I didn't perform outrage. That made people comfortable. It also made them assume I wouldn't be a problem. There's a particular way organizations categorize women like me. not threatening enough to fear, too competent to ignore entirely, useful, safe, replaceable but not urgently so. I was the kind of employee leadership liked to point to as evidence that the system worked, without ever asking me if it did. If there were conflicts, I was the translator. If there were compliance questions, I was the filter. If there were interpersonal tensions, I was the quiet buffer who smoothed language until it sounded professional enough to survive email. What I wasn't seen as was someone with a line. And to be fair, I hadn't drawn one yet. I had built my career on the belief that credibility came from consistency, that if I showed up prepared, ethical, and steady long enough, I wouldn't need to demand respect. It would arrive on its own. That belief wasn't naive when I formed it. It just belonged to a system that no longer existed. From the outside, my role looked solid. Senior title, cross-functional trust, access to information others didn't have. People assumed I had influence. In reality, I had proximity. And proximity is not power, it's exposure. I was copied on emails that made my stomach tighten. I sat in meetings where decisions were framed carefully enough to sound legal, not ethical. I watched language get adjusted just enough to remove responsibility without removing harm. Each time I told myself the same thing: this isn't my fight. Not yet. Stay professional. Observe. No one told me to stay quiet. That's the part people misunderstand. Silence wasn't enforced. It was rewarded. The less emotional I was, the more I was trusted. The more I absorbed without reacting, the more responsibility I was given. My restraint was mistaken for agreement. When new hires joined, I became a reference point. Ask Vera, they were told. She knows how things really work. That should have felt like authority. Instead, it felt like a weight. Because knowing how things really work means knowing when the official story isn't the true one. And still, I stayed. I stayed because I believed integrity was cumulative. Because I thought systems corrected themselves when enough reasonable people participated honestly. Because nothing had crossed a line clearly enough that I could point to it without sounding dramatic, and I was determined never to be that woman. Looking back now, I can see how cleanly I fit into the shape they needed. I was the calm in the room that allowed others to be careless. The professional tone that softened unethical edges. The person whose presence made questionable decisions feel reviewed even when they weren't challenged. I don't say this with bitterness, only accuracy. Before everything shifted, before reporting, before retaliation, this is who I was to them. Reliable, quiet, invaluable, but not irreplaceable. And most importantly, unlikely to push back. That assumption shaped everything that followed. The first moment didn't arrive with drama. It rarely does. It was a meeting I'd attended dozens of times before. Same room, same polished table, same faint smell of burnt coffee and recycled air. A quarterly review. Senior leadership present. Slides were already approved before anyone sat down. I noticed the shift before I could name it. An executive I'd worked alongside for years. Someone who regularly relied on my summaries and compliance checks. Presented a decision that directly contradicted a risk assessment I had submitted 2 weeks earlier. Not reframed, not challenged, simply erased. My name wasn't mentioned, the document wasn't referenced, the concern no longer existed. I waited, not in protest, just in curiosity. I assumed there would be a pause, a footnote, a polite acknowledgement that the assessment had been considered and set aside. There wasn't. The room moved on as if the risk had never been raised. Heads nodded. Someone made a joke. Another slide appeared. I felt something then. Not anger, not fear, a quiet disorientation, the kind that comes when reality tilts just slightly and no one else seems to feel it. I spoke once, carefully. I just want to clarify, I said, keeping my tone neutral, whether the mitigation plan accounts for the regulatory exposure outlined in the prior review. The executive didn't look at me. He smiled at the room. We've got that covered, he said. No explanation, no follow-up, just enough confidence to close the door. And it worked. No one asked what I was referring to. No one requested the document. No one circled back after. The meeting ended on time. Action items were assigned, none of them to me. Afterward, a colleague caught up to me in the hallway. Someone I trusted, someone who'd seen the same slide. "You okay?" she asked lightly. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. At least I thought I did. She hesitated, then added, "You know how he is. It's probably not worth pushing." That sentence lodged itself somewhere uncomfortable. Not worth pushing. It implied that what I'd raised wasn't important enough to disturb momentum. Or worse, that pushing would cost more than the risk itself. I went back to my desk and pulled up my original assessment. Read it again, line by line, searching for exaggeration, for error, for something I'd missed that would justify its quiet removal. There was nothing. So I did what I'd always done. I documented. I sent a follow-up email, brief, factual, non-confrontational, reiterating the risk, attaching the original analysis, and offering to discuss mitigation options. I CC'd the appropriate parties. I didn't escalate. I didn't accuse. I assumed good faith. No one replied. Not immediately. Not later. Not ever. The next week, a revised project plan circulated. My input was nowhere in it. Not rejected, just absent. That was the cut. Small enough to dismiss, clean enough to explain away, deep enough to feel. I told myself it was a misunderstanding, a political oversight, a personality clash that had nothing to do with me personally. I reminded myself that organizations are messy and good work isn't always visible. But something had shifted. I began to notice how often my contributions were summarized by others in rooms I wasn't in. How decisions were made with compliance in mind without actually involving compliance. How my role subtly moved from advisor to afterthought. No one said I'd done anything wrong. No one needed to. The message was conveyed through absence. What stayed with me wasn't the professional slight. It was the ease with which it happened. How quickly a documented concern could be smoothed out of existence when it became inconvenient. How little resistance there was to pretending it had never been raised. Everyone else forgot that meeting. I didn't. Because once you see how quietly truth can be edited out, you start to wonder how often it's already happened, and who pays the price when it is. At the time, I still believed this was an exception. A small cut, not a pattern. Something to note, not to challenge. I hadn't yet understood that the first dismissal is rarely about the content. It's a test, and I had just passed it by staying reasonable. After the first cut, nothing visibly changed. That's how normalization works. The environment stays the same, so you tell yourself you're overreacting. The meetings continue, the emails keep coming, your access isn't revoked, no one confronts you. And because nothing is overtly hostile, you adapt. I began to recognize a pattern long before I admitted it to myself. Concerns raised in writing were acknowledged verbally, but never actioned. Requests for clarification were met with reassuring language instead of answers. When I flagged issues early, I was thanked for my thoroughness and then excluded from the follow-up where decisions were finalized. It was subtle, always subtle. No one told me to stop speaking. They simply stopped responding when I did. I told myself this was how senior environments operated, that not every concern made it to the top, that leadership had information I didn't, that my role was advisory, not directive. These explanations were comforting because they preserved my belief in the system. They also required me to swallow a growing sense of dissonance. I noticed how often I was asked to review things after they'd already been approved, how frequently my name was used to signal diligence without granting actual influence. Vera has looked at this, someone would say, even when what I'd done was flag a risk that went unresolved. At first, I corrected the record quietly, then less often, then not at all. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being technically included but functionally ignored. It makes you doubt your instincts. It teaches you to soften your language preemptively, to frame concerns as questions, to remove urgency, to sound agreeable even when you're not. I became very good at that. When a colleague suggested I was over-indexing on risk, I laughed it off. When an executive joked that I was our internal conscience, I smiled politely. When someone said, "Let's not slow this down," I adjusted my timelines instead of my objections. Each compromise felt small, reasonable, professional. Together, they reshaped me. I stopped raising issues in meetings where I knew momentum mattered more than accuracy. I saved my comments for follow-ups where they could be safely ignored without public friction. I told myself this was strategic, that choosing my battles made me more effective. What I didn't want to admit was that I was learning how to disappear without leaving. The organization rewarded this adaptation. I was praised for being flexible, for understanding the bigger picture. My performance reviews were strong. My workload increased. I was entrusted with more responsibility, not more authority. That distinction matters. Responsibility without authority is a quiet form of containment. You carry the weight, but you don't steer the direction. And if something goes wrong, your proximity becomes liability. There were moments, small, sharp ones, where my discomfort resurfaced. An email thread where my warning appeared as a footnote after the fact. A decision that went forward despite a clear policy conflict. A junior employee came to me in private because they didn't feel safe raising a concern themselves. I listened, I advised, I documented. And then I told myself it wasn't my place to escalate unless something truly serious happened. That was the story I told myself to stay, because leaving would mean admitting that professionalism hadn't protected me, that doing things the right way hadn't earned me respect, and that realization was more destabilizing than the disrespect itself. So I normalized it. I learned to anticipate dismissal and adjust my expectations accordingly. I recalibrated what success looked like, from influencing outcomes to surviving intact, from being heard to not being blamed. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. I was still competent, still trusted, still calm. Inside, something was hardening, not into anger, but into clarity I wasn't ready to face. The truth was, I wasn't staying quiet because I was weak. I was staying quiet because I believed restraint was still currency. That patience would eventually be rewarded. That consistency would outweigh convenience. What I didn't yet understand was that the longer you accept erasure, the easier it becomes to justify removing you entirely. By the time I realized that, silence had already started to feel like the safest option. And safety, I would learn, is not the same as security. I didn't realize I'd been cast until I noticed how uncomfortable people became when I stepped even slightly out of character. The role was unspoken, but everyone seemed to know it. I was the steady one, the reasonable one, the person who absorbed complexity and returned it in a form that didn't disturb the room. I was expected to translate problems, not introduce them. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. When I raised concerns gently, they were welcomed. When I raised them clearly, they were deflected. When I raised them persistently, the tone shifted, not to anger, but to disappointment, as if I were breaking an agreement I hadn't realized I'd signed. I began to hear it in the language used around me. Vera will help us phrase this. Let's run it by Vera, so we're covered. She's good at smoothing things out. Smoothing, that was the word. I wasn't being asked to protect integrity, I was being asked to protect optics. My job, as they seemed to understand it, was to make difficult things sound acceptable, to reduce friction, to ensure plausible deniability, and as long as I stayed within that boundary, I was valued. The moment I stepped outside it, even slightly, I became inconvenient. There was an instance where a senior leader asked me privately to adjust the language of a report so it would land better with the board. The change he wanted wasn't overtly dishonest, it was worse. It was vague enough to blur accountability. I suggested an alternative phrasing, accurate, neutral, defensible. He smiled, but his patience thinned. You're overthinking this, he said. We just need it to feel aligned. Aligned with what? He didn't say. I remember sitting there nodding, feeling the familiar pull to comply, to be helpful, to maintain my position as the person who made things easier. And in that moment, I understood something clearly for the first time. They didn't need my judgment. They needed my compliance dressed up as professionalism. The realization wasn't explosive, it was quiet, almost disappointing, like discovering a relationship had been transactional all along. After that, the expectations became easier to predict. I was looped in late, asked to review, not revise, consulted, not listened to. My presence served as a shield, proof that someone responsible had been involved, even when my recommendations were sidelined. When I did push back, the response was consistent. Let's not escalate this. This is above our pay grade. We don't want to create unnecessary tension. Each phrase carried the same message: know your place. I wasn't being silenced, I was being managed. And the most effective part was that it looked from the outside like respect. I was included, I was thanked, I was trusted, just not trusted to change anything that mattered. I watched others play their roles too. The assertive ones who were tolerated because they delivered revenue. The charismatic ones who could say anything as long as it sounded confident. The quiet ones who learned, like me, where the invisible boundaries were. The system didn't punish everyone. It only corrected those who disrupted its preferred rhythm. By then, I understood exactly what was expected of me. Be useful, not influential. Be ethical, not obstructive. Be calm, not consequential. And as long as I performed that role well, I would remain safe. Or so it seemed. What I hadn't yet reckoned with was what happens when the role itself becomes a liability, when being the person who knows too much, documents too well, and asks the wrong questions quietly starts to feel dangerous to others. I was still inside the system, still playing my part, still telling myself that endurance was professionalism. But something in me had shifted from accommodation to awareness. I was beginning to understand that the role I'd been assigned was not one that allowed survival, only usefulness. And usefulness has an expiration date. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment anyone else would remember. It was an email, a short one, polite, carefully worded. I had raised a concern, again, about a pattern I'd been tracking for months. Not a single incident, but a convergence of behaviors that together created real exposure. I laid it out clearly, with dates, references, and suggested next steps. I sent it only to the people who needed to see it. No theatrics, no mass distribution. The reply came 2 hours later. Thanks, Vera. Let's discuss offline. That phrase used to reassure me. It sounded reasonable, mature, controlled. This time it didn't, because I knew what offline meant now. It meant no record, no witnesses, no follow-up. A conversation that would never be summarized accurately in writing. Still, I agreed. The meeting was brief, cordial, almost friendly. The executive thanked me for my diligence, acknowledged that I was technically correct. Then he leaned back and said something I still remember word for word. You need to be careful about how much of this you put in writing. It can be misinterpreted. He didn't threaten me. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't tell me to stop. He warned me. In that moment, the ground shifted, because warnings don't exist unless there's something to fear. And the fear wasn't mine. I nodded. I said I understood. I thanked him for the guidance. I left the room composed. Inside, something went very still. For the first time, I saw the situation clearly. Not as a series of misunderstandings, but as a system protecting itself. My role wasn't to help it correct course. My role was to ensure its risks remained manageable, undocumented, and deniable. And now even that was becoming uncomfortable. I returned to my desk and opened my notebook, the one I'd always kept but rarely needed. I didn't write emotionally. I wrote factually: date, time, exact language, context. That wasn't the shift itself. The shift was the decision that followed. I stopped trying to be understood. Up until then, some part of me had still been invested in explaining, in clarifying. I believed that if I just framed things correctly, reason would prevail. That day, I let go of that impulse. Not out of anger, out of recognition. You can't reason with the system that benefits from your silence. From that point on, I listened differently. I stopped filling in gaps for people. I stopped softening my language preemptively. I asked fewer questions in meetings and paid closer attention to what wasn't being said. And I noticed how often decisions relied on the assumption that I would absorb the risk quietly. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change my demeanor. Externally, nothing shifted. Internally, everything did. I began to understand that silence could be something other than submission. That restraint could be intentional. That calm didn't have to mean agreement. That was the day I stopped being reactive. Not because I had a plan yet, but because I knew I would need one. The system had shown its hand, not aggressively, not cruelly, just clearly enough that I could no longer pretend I was safe by being reasonable. I went home that evening and slept well, better than I had in months. Because clarity, even when it's uncomfortable, is lighter than confusion. And from that day forward, every choice I made would be informed by a single, quiet truth. I was no longer trying to belong. I was preparing to protect myself. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, an instinct shaped by years of being rewarded for restraint. Now it was deliberate, measured, chosen. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't withdraw. I didn't become cold or distant. I stayed exactly as I was on the surface. Same tone, same reliability, same calm presence in meetings. That was the point. People assumed nothing had changed. In fact, many seemed relieved. The concerns I used to raise, carefully, persistently, appeared to fade. The questions stopped coming. The follow-up emails grew shorter. To them, it looked like acceptance. In reality, it was observation. I stopped volunteering information, not because I lacked it, but because I no longer believed it would be handled responsibly. I answered questions precisely as asked, no more, no less. I documented privately what I no longer escalated publicly, and I paid attention to how people reacted. Some took advantage of the quiet immediately. They spoke more freely in front of me, assuming my silence meant alignment. They referenced decisions I knew were questionable with casual confidence. They began to treat my presence as neutral, no longer a checkpoint, just background. Others grew subtly more comfortable. The tension that used to enter the room when I asked for clarification dissipated. Meetings moved faster. Decisions landed without friction. Efficiency returned. That's when I understood something essential. My earlier resistance had been the only thing slowing them down, not because I was obstructive, but because I made risk visible. Without that, momentum felt smoother, even when it was headed in the wrong direction. I watched them mistake my quiet for compliance. One executive joked in passing, "Looks like we finally broke you in." He laughed. I smiled. He meant it as praise. Inside, I noted the date. The irony was that I was working harder than ever, but none of that work was visible. I wasn't fixing problems anymore. I was mapping them. I was tracking patterns. Not just decisions, but behaviors. Who spoke over whom? Who avoided documentation? Who grew defensive when certain topics arose? I began to see how informal power flowed, how influence moved through relationships, not titles, how certain people were protected by proximity to leadership, while others were quietly isolated, and I saw my own position clearly. I wasn't powerful, but I was central. I touched processes that others depended on. I understood systems that few bothered to learn. I had access, not authority, but access is leverage if you know how to use it. Still, I said nothing. Not because I was afraid, but because I was waiting. Waiting for confirmation that what I'd seen wasn't an anomaly. Waiting to understand how far the system would go once it believed I was no longer paying attention. It didn't take long. Decisions grew sloppier. Language grew looser. People stopped double-checking things around me. The safeguards I'd quietly enforced over the years, often without credit, began to erode. And with that erosion came risk, real risk, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's too late. I didn't intervene. That was the hardest part. Everything in me was trained to step in, to prevent damage before it occurred. But I understood now that preventing harm for a system that punishes accountability only delays reckoning and shifts blame onto the person who tried to help. So I let things proceed, not recklessly, not maliciously, just without my quiet corrections. They mistook that for weakness, for fatigue, for resignation. In performance conversations, I was praised for being more aligned, for trusting leadership, for letting go of unnecessary friction. I accepted the feedback neutrally, took notes, thanked them. What they didn't know was that my silence had become a form of preparation. I wasn't disengaging. I was stepping back far enough to see the whole structure and where it would crack under its own weight. Silence, when chosen consciously, is not absence. It is positioning. What they never noticed was how much I was learning while they grew comfortable. My silence didn't mean disengagement, it meant focus. Without the emotional labor of being heard or dismissed, I had bandwidth, and I used it carefully. I started by paying attention to systems instead of people, not just the official ones. The reporting structures, compliance frameworks, escalation paths, but the informal systems that actually governed behavior. Who approved what without review? Which decisions bypassed policy through temporary exceptions that never expired? Where documentation was intentionally thinned until accountability dissolved into ambiguity. I tracked patterns, not incidents. Anyone can explain away one mistake. Patterns are harder to deny. I noticed how often approvals happened verbally, how frequently were key decisions summarized vaguely in writing afterward, if at all. How certain leaders insisted on phone calls when topics touched compliance, risk, or ethics. And I noted who benefited from that lack of traceability. I also revisited policies I'd once taken for granted, not skimming them, but reading them the way regulators do, line by line, context by context. I cross-referenced internal language with external obligations. I looked for gaps between what we claimed to do and what we actually did. There were more than I expected. At the same time, I began organizing my documentation differently. Not emotionally, not defensively, methodically. Dates, times, versions, exact wording. What was said, what was decided, what was omitted. I stopped framing notes as concerns and started framing them as records. That distinction matters. Concerns can be dismissed as subjective. Records are neutral. They don't accuse. They simply exist. I didn't store everything in one place. I didn't label anything dramatically. I treated the information the way archivists treat fragile materials, with respect, separation, and clarity. No single document told the story. Together they did. I also learned more about retaliation, not from experience yet, but from research. Quietly, after hours. I read case studies, regulatory guidance, whistleblower protections that look strong on paper and weak in practice. I learned how often retaliation isn't overt, how rarely it looks like punishment, how commonly it appears as restructuring, performance recalibration, or loss of confidence. And I learned something else. Retaliation often begins before a formal report is made, when leadership senses risk and moves preemptively to contain it. That knowledge shaped how I positioned myself. I stayed competent, dependable, calm. My performance never dipped. My relationships remained professional. I gave no one a reason to question my credibility. At the same time, I quietly reduced my vulnerability. I made sure my work products were clear and defensible. I stopped doing unpaid emotional labor. I ensured my contributions were traceable without being attention-seeking. I began building external references, not asking for favors, just maintaining professional visibility outside the organization. Nothing obvious, nothing sudden. From their perspective, I was still the same Vera. Maybe quieter, maybe easier. Certainly not a threat. What they didn't see was that I had stopped assuming good faith and started verifying it. There were moments where the urge to intervene resurfaced. A decision that would likely cause harm. A junior employee is being put in an impossible position. A policy bent just far enough to snap later. Each time I asked myself the same question. If I step in now, who benefits? And who pays the cost? Too often, the answer was the same. The system benefited. I absorbed the risk. So instead, I documented. I observed. I waited. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about exposure. At least not yet. It was about understanding leverage. Because leverage doesn't come from outrage. It comes from clarity. By the time others began to sense that something was off, not with the organization, but with me, it was already too late to locate the shift. There was nothing to point to. No confrontation, no complaint. Just a quiet competence that no longer included cover. And that made some people uneasy. I could see it in how conversations paused when I entered rooms, how jokes were softened, how decisions were explained a little too carefully around me, even though I hadn't asked. They felt watched. They were right. What they never noticed was that the power dynamic had already changed. Not because I had authority, but because I had context. I understood the system better than those who relied on it to protect them. And once you understand a system deeply enough, you don't need to fight it. You only need to know when to step aside and let it reveal itself. That was the phase I was in then. Preparation without announcement. Learning without interruption. Positioning without visibility. The story wasn't moving yet, but the groundwork was complete. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. By the time it became clear, I had already suspected it. Still, there's a difference between suspicion and confirmation. One unsettles you. The other changes how you breathe. It happened late, after most people had gone home. I was reviewing a set of documents connected to a decision I'd tracked for months. One of those temporary exceptions that had quietly become permanent. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was reconciling versions. That's when I saw it, a sequence that didn't align, a date that couldn't be true unless something had been backfilled, an approval recorded before the review it supposedly depended on. Not a clerical error, too consistent for that, too clean. I pulled the related files, cross-checked timestamps, compared the language across drafts, and there it was. A pattern of retroactive documentation designed to create the appearance of compliance after the fact. No single instance would have mattered. Together, they formed a narrative that contradicted the organization's public claims and its legal obligations. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. Because leverage isn't exciting when you understand what it costs to use it. I sat there for a long time looking at the screen, not calculating exposure, not imagining consequences, just letting the reality settle. This wasn't about one executive or one department. It was structural, normalized, embedded, and I was standing inside it, fully aware now of where the fault lines ran. The clarity was almost sobering. Up until then, part of me had still hoped that my discomfort came from misalignment, not misconduct. That reasonable explanations would eventually surface. That leadership simply hadn't seen what I'd seen. That illusion ended quietly that evening. I closed the files and wrote nothing new. I didn't send an email. I didn't flag it to anyone. I didn't even copy the documents right away. I thought about what reporting actually meant, about how whistleblower protections are framed versus how they're lived, about how retaliation rarely targets the content, it targets the person who disrupts the equilibrium. I thought about my own position, my visibility, my financial runway, my support system, the difference between being right and being protected. And I realized something else, just as important as the discovery itself. I didn't need to prove anything yet. The leverage wasn't in exposing the issue immediately, it was in understanding it fully, its scope, its dependencies, and the people who would be implicated by proximity alone. Information is only power when it's contextualized, so I began to map it, not emotionally, structurally. What decisions relied on these documents? Who signed off and who didn't want to sign? Which policies were cited publicly but ignored privately? Where would scrutiny naturally flow if questions were asked? The answers formed a quiet web, not explosive, but undeniable. I also saw how vulnerable I was. I was still an employee, still dependent on the system. I might eventually challenge it, still subject to performance narratives that could be rewritten overnight. That awareness kept me grounded. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, just a sober understanding that I was now holding something that couldn't be unseen, and that handling it poorly could cost me far more than silence ever had. For the first time, I fully grasped the asymmetry of power. They had resources, lawyers, influence, time. What I had was accuracy. And accuracy, when handled carefully, has its own gravity. I didn't rush. I didn't escalate. I didn't even decide what I would do next. The private reveal wasn't a call to action. It was a moment of orientation, a point where the map finally matched the terrain. From then on, every interaction felt different, not because I acted differently, but because I understood the stakes beneath the surface. I could see how quickly things could turn if I moved too fast, how easily my credibility could be questioned if I misstepped, how the narrative could shift from concerned professional to difficult employee with the slightest push. That knowledge didn't frighten me. It disciplined me. The leverage was real, but so was the responsibility. And for the first time, I knew that whatever came next, I would not move out of frustration or idealism. I would move only when I could do so without destroying myself in the process. That was the clarity the reveal gave me. Nothing more, nothing less. Knowing something and deciding what to do with it are not the same thing. For weeks after the reveal, I did nothing that looked like action. I went to work. I completed my responsibilities. I maintained my composure. On the surface, my life remained unchanged. Internally, I was evaluating options. There were many, and none of them were clean. I could stay silent, let the system continue, protect my position, my income, my reputation, accept the discomfort as the cost of stability. Plenty of people do that every day, and they're not villains for it. Silence would have kept me safe, at least in the short term. I could leave quietly, find another role, carry the knowledge with me, but no longer be responsible for it. That option was tempting. It promised relief without confrontation, but it also meant walking away from something unresolved and knowing that others would bear the consequences of decisions I'd witnessed and documented. I could escalate internally, report through official channels, trust the process I'd once believed in. That option looked responsible on paper and dangerous in reality. I had seen how concerns were absorbed, diluted, and reframed. I knew how exposed I would be long before any investigation concluded. Or I could take the path that couldn't be undone. Formal reporting, carefully prepared, externally informed, and documented in a way that didn't rely on goodwill. That path carried risk, real risk, professional isolation, retaliation that would never be labeled as such, a future shaped by legal language instead of assumptions. I didn't rush the choice. I examined my motives closely. I asked myself whether I was acting out of anger. I wasn't. Whether I wanted vindication. I didn't. Whether I was prepared to lose things I valued. That question took longer. What tipped the balance wasn't outrage, it was a responsibility. I thought about the junior employees who had come to me quietly, trusting my judgment, about the policies we claimed to uphold publicly, about the certainty that if harm eventually surfaced, leadership would say they had no knowledge, and the record would support that claim, because the record had been curated to do exactly that. I understood then that neutrality wasn't neutral, that choosing comfort over accuracy was still a choice, with consequences for people who didn't get to opt out. So I chose the irreversible option, not impulsively, not dramatically, methodically. I prepared my documentation with care, removed speculation, stuck to verifiable facts, organized timelines, ensured clarity. I sought external legal guidance, not to pursue conflict, but to understand protection. I didn't tell colleagues, I didn't hint, I didn't posture. I continued as before. When the report was finally submitted, it didn't feel like courage. It felt like alignment. Alignment between what I knew and what I was willing to live with. I understood that once this step was taken, there would be no return to invisibility, even if nothing came of it immediately, even if the outcome wasn't justice in the way people imagine. My relationship with the organization would change. They would sense the shift eventually. Systems always do. And I would need to be ready for what followed. I wasn't naive about the consequences. I didn't expect gratitude. I didn't expect protection to be clean or complete. I expected discomfort, isolation, a subtle reframing of my identity. What I didn't expect was how calm I felt afterward. Not relieved, not triumphant, just steady. The decision had clarified my internal boundaries. I knew what I stood for and what I was no longer willing to absorb quietly. From that point on, whatever happened wouldn't be about indecision. It would be about response. And that knowledge gave me a kind of quiet resolve that no policy or title ever had. After the decision, nothing happened. That was the unsettling part. No emails, no meetings, no sudden shift in tone. The report existed now, submitted, logged, acknowledged, but the surface of my daily work remained unchanged. And in that stillness, I understood something important. Systems don't react immediately to disruption. They observe first, they measure risk, they wait. So did I. I didn't announce anything. I didn't alter my behavior. I didn't become cautious in a way that would draw attention. I moved the way I always had, calm, reliable, quietly competent. But underneath that continuity, I was preparing. I reviewed my finances carefully, reduced unnecessary expenses, increased my emergency buffer. I didn't assume the worst, but I planned for it. Security isn't pessimism, it's foresight. I documented my work more thoroughly than ever. Not defensively, professionally. Clear deliverables, time-stamped communications, confirmations in writing. I made sure that nothing I touched could later be reframed as negligence or insubordination. I stopped accepting verbal instructions for anything ambiguous. When decisions were made in conversation, I followed up with neutral summaries, not accusatory, not detailed enough to provoke concern, just accurate enough to exist. No one objected. That told me everything. I also adjusted my internal posture. I no longer volunteered for tasks that blurred accountability. I declined politely when requests fell outside my role without documentation. I wasn't resistant, I was precise. People interpreted this as efficiency. They were wrong. It was containment. I noticed how slowly the atmosphere shifted around me. Conversations that once included me began to happen elsewhere. Information arrived later than before. Decisions were presented as conclusions, not discussions. Still, nothing overt. Retaliation rarely begins with confrontation. It begins with repositioning. I wasn't excluded outright. I was rerouted. I watched how leadership communicated about transparency, how often the word appeared in town halls, how rarely it appeared in practice. I listened to assurances that sounded rehearsed. I noted which initiatives suddenly emphasized alignment and trust. Language always changes before behavior does. I kept my counsel. Externally, I maintained my professional network. Quiet check-ins, no disclosures, just visibility. I didn't want escape. I wanted optionality. And through all of it, I waited for the first unmistakable signal that the system had registered my report as a threat. It came quietly. A calendar invite was removed without explanation. A responsibility I'd held for years was reassigned temporarily. A performance conversation included a vague note about tone. None of it was actionable. That was the design. I didn't react. Reaction would have given them something to point to. Instead, I continued documenting, continued performing, continued existing exactly as I had before, except now I understood the choreography. What they didn't notice was how insulated I'd become. I no longer relied on informal trust. I no longer assumed context would protect me. I no longer believed my value would speak for itself. Everything that mattered now existed in records. And records don't forget. There was a strange calm in this phase, a sense of being slightly ahead of the current. I knew pressure would come eventually, but until then, the quiet was strategic. They thought I was waiting. In truth, I was watching how quickly accountability dissolved once scrutiny became possible, watching who distanced themselves, watching who stayed silent when my role narrowed without justification, and watching who, without realizing it, revealed exactly how the system responded to perceived risk. Nothing had exploded yet, but the ground had already shifted. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They surfaced the way pressure changes in a sealed room. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible, until everyone inside begins to feel uneasy without knowing why. I noticed it in how work slowed down around me. Requests that used to be simple became tangled. Decisions that once moved quickly stalled without explanation. People started looping me in again, not because they wanted my input, but because something wasn't working the way it used to. At first, they didn't connect the loss of efficiency to me. They assumed it was market conditions, staffing, one of those quarters. But I could see it clearly. The quiet safeguards I'd provided for years without recognition were no longer compensating for poor decisions upstream. Without my silent corrections, small cracks widened into visible strain. Meetings grew longer, language grew more cautious. Someone would say, "We should probably run this by compliance," and then hesitate, uncertain whether that still meant me. When they did ask, I responded professionally, factually, within scope. No more, no less. The first person to feel it was a director who'd often relied on my discretion. He stopped by my desk one afternoon, casual but tense. "Things seem harder lately," he said. "Not sure why." I nodded. "There's a lot moving at once." He waited, as if expecting more. There was none. That was new. Soon after, I heard my name in rooms I wasn't invited into, not defensively, confused. People are trying to locate the missing piece without admitting it had ever existed. "She used to catch this stuff. Why didn't anyone flag this earlier?" I thought compliance had eyes on this. They weren't blaming me, not yet. They were disoriented. Because when you remove quiet competence from a system that depends on it, the system doesn't immediately collapse. It stumbles, reaches, assumes the support is still there. And when it isn't, discomfort spreads outward. Leadership responded by tightening control, more check-ins, more oversight, more emphasis on process, without addressing the underlying issues. That only made things worse. People became careful in ways that slowed progress without increasing integrity. Decisions were deferred, accountability blurred. The same names surfaced again and again as bottlenecks. Mine wasn't one of them. I remained steady, reliable, exactly as my job description required. That unnerved them. At one point, a senior manager asked me directly, "Is there something we should be worried about?" I met his gaze, not beyond what's already documented. He didn't press. He couldn't. The cost of that question was too high. What followed was isolation, not abrupt but cumulative. Fewer invitations, fewer informal conversations, a narrowing of my functional space. They weren't punishing me. They were adapting to uncertainty, and in doing so, they began to feel the weight of their own decisions. I watched teams struggle with issues I'd once absorbed quietly. Watched junior employees flounder without the guidance that used to come from me indirectly. Watched leaders scramble to create structure after dismissing it for speed. No one connected it to retaliation. No one needed to. The system was correcting, not ethically, but operationally, and it resented the friction. There were moments when I felt the urge to step in, to smooth things over, to help. But I remembered why I'd stopped. Helping now would have meant resuming a role that protected the system from consequences it needed to face. And I wasn't willing to do that anymore. The consequences were not loud. They were slow, inefficient, uncomfortable, and they spread. By the time leadership began to sense that the issue wasn't a single project or team, but a structural vulnerability, they were already too late to isolate the cause without exposing themselves. They didn't know it yet, but the system had begun to feel the absence of the very thing it had taught me to withhold. By the time panic surfaced, it was no longer sharp. It was diffuse, unfocused, the kind that spreads when people realize something fundamental is wrong, but no one can agree on where it started. That's when leadership began reaching backward. Suddenly, old documents mattered. Past decisions were reopened. People searched email threads with a new kind of urgency. Less to understand, more to defend. Questions were asked that would have been routine months earlier, now loaded with anxiety. What was the basis for this? Who signed off? Why wasn't this flagged? The answers existed, just not in the places they wanted them to. I was pulled into meetings framed as alignment check-ins. The tone was careful, polite, almost conciliatory. People spoke slowly around me, choosing words that sounded collaborative while circling something they didn't want to name. They weren't asking me to help. They were trying to assess damage. At one point, a senior leader said, "We all want to make sure we're protected here." Protected from what? He didn't say. I responded the only way I could, factually. "I've documented my role and recommendations where applicable," I said. "Those records haven't changed." That sentence landed harder than I intended, because it closed a door. What they wanted, though they would never ask for it directly, was reassurance. Confirmation that I would help clean this up quietly the way I always had. That I would contextualize, soften, translate. I didn't. Not aggressively, not definitely. I simply stayed accurate. That's when the regret began. Not remorse for the actions themselves, but regret that the system no longer had room to maneuver. Those decisions, once protected by vagueness, were now pinned to timelines. That informal agreements had left no trace, while formal records remained stubbornly intact. They tried to recreate trust with language. "We value transparency. We want to learn from this. We're all on the same team." But transparency, when it arrives too late, feels like exposure. I could see the confusion settle in. People weren't sure who to talk to anymore. Who was safe? Which conversations needed to happen in writing, and which shouldn't happen at all? The casual confidence was gone. In its place was hesitation. One afternoon, I was asked again to review a revised plan, the same one I'd raised concerns about months earlier. This time, the language had changed. The risks were acknowledged. The mitigation strategies mirrored what I'd suggested before. "Does this address your concerns?" someone asked carefully. I read it once, slowly. "Yes," I said. "It reflects what I outlined previously." There was a pause. "What changed?" they asked. I didn't answer, because the truth was simple and unacceptable. It wasn't that the issue had changed. It was that ignoring it was no longer safe. That realization rippled outward. People began to distance themselves from past decisions, to reframe involvement, to emphasize uncertainty. The narrative shifted from confidence to confusion, everyone trying to locate the moment where responsibility could be deflected. But responsibility doesn't disappear. It just waits. By then, the processes were already in motion. External scrutiny moved at its own pace. Documentation spoke without emotion. Timelines didn't bend to urgency. There were no dramatic confrontations, no accusations hurled across conference tables, just the quiet understanding that the window for internal resolution had closed. Too many things had been left undocumented, too many warnings reframed as overcaution, too many chances were dismissed because they were inconvenient. And now no amount of alignment meetings could reverse that. I watched people try to repair relationships that had been transactional all along. I watched leaders attempt to reassert control through reassurance instead of accountability. It didn't work, because trust can't be retroactively installed. By the time they understood that, the system was no longer responding to intention, only to evidence. And evidence has no interest in apologies. The confrontation, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no accusations sharp enough to bruise. It arrived as a meeting request with a neutral title and too many senior names attached. A sign, if you know how to read them, that something had already been decided, or at least framed. I walked in prepared, not with arguments, but with steadiness. They thanked me for coming. They spoke about alignment, about culture, about how difficult things had become for everyone. The words were soft, careful, designed to sound collaborative while shifting the emotional burden onto the room. I listened. Eventually, one of them said, "We're trying to understand how things escalated to this point." That was the opening. I didn't fill the silence. After a moment, I said, "The escalation didn't happen suddenly. It was cumulative." They nodded, as if that confirmed something they already suspected. Another voice added, "Do you feel you gave us enough opportunity to address your concerns internally?" The question was not neutral. It was an invitation to defend myself or to accept partial blame. I chose neither. "I followed established channels," I said calmly. "I documented concerns as they arose. The records reflect that. No emotion, no emphasis, Just a fact. The room grew quiet in a different way then. Not uncomfortable, contained. The kind of silence that appears when people realize there's nothing left to extract. They tried once more. "We're concerned about the impact this has had," someone said. "On trust." I met their eyes. "Trust depends on follow-through," I replied. "Not intention." That was the closest I came to confrontation. There was no argument because there was nothing to argue about. The documentation existed. The timelines were clear. The choices were theirs, not mine. What they wanted, again, though they never said it, was reassurance that I understood how hard this was for them, that I would acknowledge the pressure they were under, that I would share the discomfort. I didn't. Not because I lacked empathy, but because empathy doesn't require self-erasure. The meeting ended politely. They thanked me. I thanked them. We stood, exchanged neutral expressions, and left the room without resolution. And that was it. No reprimand, no apology, no closure. But something had changed permanently. After that, my presence carried a different weight. People spoke more carefully around me, not out of respect, but awareness, the unspoken understanding that I would not cushion reality for them anymore. I wasn't ostracized. I wasn't embraced. I was contained. And that was fine, because by then, I no longer needed validation from the system. I had clarity. I had alignment with myself. I had survived the moment everyone fears, the one where you're asked to explain your integrity to people who benefited from its absence. And I hadn't compromised it. There was no victory in that meeting, no sense of triumph, just a quiet recognition that the confrontation I'd once imagined as dramatic had, in reality, been procedural. That's how these things end, not with explosions, but with doors closing softly behind you. And once they close, you're free to walk in a different direction. I don't tell this story because it ended cleanly. It didn't. There was no moment where everything resolved and the world made sense again. No formal acknowledgement that I had been right. No apology delivered with the gravity people imagine closure requires. What there was instead was distance. Distance from a system that no longer defined me. Distance from roles that required me to be useful at the expense of myself. Distance from the version of professionalism that equated silence with maturity. That distance changed me. I am quieter now, but not in the way I used to be. My silence no longer asks for approval. It no longer absorbs tension to make others comfortable. It exists as a boundary. I'm more selective with where I invest my energy, more deliberate about the environments I enter. I don't confuse access with influence anymore, or proximity with power. I've learned that competence, when unprotected, becomes leverage for others, not for you, and so I protect it. I work differently now, with clearer contracts, clearer expectations, clearer exit paths. I don't stay where clarity is treated as an inconvenience or ethics as optional. That doesn't make me difficult. It makes me aligned. There's a version of this story where I become hardened, cynical, distrustful. That version would be understandable, but it isn't who I am. I still believe in integrity. I just no longer outsource it to institutions. I still believe in professionalism. I just don't confuse it with endurance. I still believe in systems. I just understand how easily they prioritize self-preservation over accountability. What changed most wasn't my career. It was my sense of self. I no longer measure my worth by how much I can absorb quietly. I don't equate being liked with being respected, and I don't wait for permission to trust my own discomfort. I know now that the cost of silence isn't paid all at once. It's paid slowly, through self-doubt, erosion, and the gradual shrinking of your internal boundaries. Choosing myself didn't make me loud. It made me solid. There are moments, still, when I think about the people I left behind. The ones who are still smoothing, still translating, still telling themselves that patience will protect them. I don't judge them. Everyone has their own moment of clarity, or their own reason not to seek one yet. If anything, this experience made me more compassionate, not less. Because I know how easy it is to confuse survival with safety, how tempting it is to believe that doing everything right will eventually shield you. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. What matters is knowing the difference and choosing consciously. I didn't emerge from this as a hero. I emerged as myself. Someone who understands that quiet dominance isn't about control or revenge. It's about refusing to abandon yourself in order to belong. That understanding stays with me now, in every room I enter and every decision I make. And I carry it lightly. There's a version of this story that people often expect. One where the truth is rewarded quickly, where accountability is clean, where the person who speaks up is protected, validated, and restored. That version is comforting. It's also rare. What I learned slowly, quietly, without drama, is that systems don't change because someone is right. They change when the cost of staying the same becomes higher than the cost of accountability. And even then, they don't thank the person who made that cost visible. That doesn't mean speaking up is a mistake. It means we need to be honest about what it asks of us. Reporting to upper management didn't make me powerful. It didn't make me popular. It didn't even make me feel brave in the way stories often frame bravery. What it did was force me to choose between two kinds of loss: the loss of comfort or the loss of self-respect. I chose the first. And that choice reshaped my life in ways that are quieter but far more enduring than vindication ever could be. If there's a moral here, it isn't always speak up, and it isn't stay silent to survive. Both are oversimplifications. Real life lives in the tension between them. The moral is this: pay attention to how a system treats calm truth. Not emotional outbursts, not dramatic conflict, but calm, documented truth. That response will tell you everything you need to know about your future there. If truth is welcomed, you may be safe. If it's tolerated but ignored, you're on borrowed time. If it's reframed as a personal flaw, you are already being positioned. And if you notice that early, really notice it, you give yourself something invaluable: choice. I didn't have control over how others reacted. I didn't get to decide whether accountability would be embraced. But I did get to decide whether I would continue participating in my own erasure. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about refusing to contort yourself into something smaller so that others don't have to feel uncomfortable. It's about understanding that integrity doesn't always protect you, but abandoning it always costs you. If you're listening to this and recognizing parts of your own experience, I want to say this clearly. You are not weak for staying quiet. You are not naive for believing in fairness. And you are not wrong for taking time to decide what your line is. Just don't let that line be drawn entirely by people who benefit from you never reaching it. Thank you for sitting with this story, for listening without demanding spectacle, for understanding that survival doesn't always look like triumph. I'll leave you with one question, one I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on in the comments. How do you know when silence is protecting you and when it's slowly costing you something you won't be able to get back?